be allowed to extend the case from their side. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I prefer my POIs verbally, please. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, the global pandemic is no joke. Thousands of people have succumbed to the coronavirus, and a very large contributing factor to this has been the improper management of medical resources and services. The cases of bribing, malpractice, illegally acquiring resources have been enormous. Imagine being in the ICU, struggling to hold on to your life when you're taken off life support because you weren't important enough to society. You couldn't buy your life back. You didn't have the resources to stay alive, and you were wronged. On side opposition, we don't stand for this. Side proposition fundamentally lost this debate when they failed to recognize that inequitable distribution actually stems from distributed sale and illegitimate manufacturing. That the most vulnerable stakeholders in this debate, the poor, the ones who aren't able to afford such medical resources during a global pandemic, are better benefited by organized, legitimate sale of life saving resources. Further, if you notice, they also conceded in their second speech that IP rights are important. They threw this out as a blanket statement, which was actually detrimental to their entire case. To win this debate, as side opposition, we need to prove to you just three things. Number one, that waiving these IP rights is actually beneficial to society as a whole. Two, that such a waiver would actually lead to a more equitable distribution of medical resources. And three, that this would ultimately mitigate the suffering of those who are unable to afford such resources on their own. I'm going to be doing three things in my speech today. Number one, rebutting the points brought out by prop. Sorry. Two, bringing you a new argument from side opposition. And three, going to take prop at their best and still show you why our world is better. Let's start then with characterization. We told you, number one, we would limit the production and sale of medical resources like vaccines, oxygen concentrators, and medicines to established licensed companies that have developed these on their own. Number two, the kinds of people that are likely to come up with these vaccines in the first place are ones who have the resources and have the license in the first place. So these look like mainstream companies in the market like Oxford that are trusted, reliable, and have been verified by legitimate sources. 3. We also believe that such companies would have mandates and ties with the government to increase their coverage. Hence, they are going. Why is this? Three reasons again. Number one, the government has a constitutional obligation to their citizens. Two, they have a re-election incentive to be voted in the next election. And three, they would also like to reap the benefits of economic prosperity that is driven by profits in the pharmaceutical industry during a pandemic. Moving on to what we get from side proposition. The first thing we get from them is the idea that somehow mass production increases. Three reasons why this is not true. Number one, we feel that the distributed sale would be taken up by profit-oriented companies that cater to the rich and overpriced, and there's likely to be more competition and not more coverage. So secondly, we feel they're not going to reach a larger demographic of people, but rather they would compete selectively for a certain group of people, which is the people who are rich enough to buy medical resources at exorbitant prices. So they're likely going to keep overpricing their products to cater to this select group of people, and hence they're not going to reach more people. And thirdly, the resources in the country remain constant, and then comes into the question who can use these, right? So we believe that licensed government organizations have a much better, can use these much better, as they can even import resources from other countries, and they can engage in a more legitimate sale of these resources instead of illegitimate underhanded sale of such resources. Secondly, they claim that this somehow helps further the political propaganda. So one, as we already mentioned, that this is not likely to be, they are not likely to propagate and spread false ideas because they have a re-election incentive. Number two, even if I somehow buy into this characterization, we feel they are likely to promote companies that they have ties with, which further increases an inequitable distribution of resources, as it caters to only their supporters, their followers, and it becomes a religious matter. Thirdly, and how somehow underprivileged countries are benefited by a distributed sale. Three responses. Number one, we feel that licensed organizations like the UN are likely going to increase their outreach, especially to the underprivileged. Second, the government has a moral obligation, has a constitutional obligation to their citizens. And three, registered organizations would reach more people. Why? Because they want to gain credibility, they want to be trusted, they want to expand their sales, and they have the government support too. And then comes the idea that somehow it leads to a lack of resources, right? So again, I think I've already sufficiently countered this, but 2 points again. This would actually lead to overhoarding by the rich and not a more equitable sale. And secondly, they are unlikely to reach the poor in the first place because of the competition that I mentioned. Now, moving on to my constructives, I'll be answering 2 questions. Number 1, why should we preserve IP rights in general? And second, and how does it benefit the biggest stakeholders in this debate today? On to my first question, on why this is morally wrong. The very companies that are likely to come up with such vaccines are primarily motivated by the fact that they would be able to reap the benefits of its IP rights at some point of time, right? When you take away these rights for them, we don't think there's an incentive for trusted companies to spend lots of money, lots of resources, and lots of employers into something that's not going to give them tangible benefits. So what happens then? A, we think they are likely to be private companies that manipulate the situation by marketing fake products at exorbitant prices to people who can afford them. Why is this bad? Number 1, this creates doubt and confusion about the veracity of these resources. This also increases the suspicion against resources like vaccines. If private companies and illegal sales predominate the market, people would be even more unsure of buying resources such as vaccines. Second, even if these resources are legitimate, they take away from people who potentially could need it more, leading to hoarding of such resources by paranoid rich individuals. Thirdly, it leads to an increase in malpractice and illegal methods of obtaining sources that could potentially incite violence and increase the production and use of black money. Lastly, it manipulates the most vulnerable who have to spend exorbitant prices for acquiring resources that they would otherwise have got at a minimal rate for all the reasons we mentioned above. Onto how this helps in a more equitable distribution. Number 1, it helps spread coverage. In order to reach more people, such medical resources would be priced at a more reasonable cost. 2, it is only used by licensed professionals, and this reduces the incidence of illegal and harmful medical resources that can actually deteriorate your health rather than increase it. Now, now look at our worst case. Even if we take side proposition at the best, we still won this debate because we were able to show you, 1, even if these vaccines are somehow overpriced, we feel it's still better in their world where you can't control the sales of these possessions of vaccines. The incidence of malpractice would be quite higher. Secondly, even if they can't reach all sections of society, they still target a major demographic of individuals who have health insurance and packages to secure their future. And because we were able to prove to you that we help in mitigating the pain of the most vulnerable, at the same time secure the rights of the society,